My wife protected herself with a prenup, but she didn't know I was about to inherit $1.5 billion. Daniel Thompson, 42, a black mechanical engineer in Chicago, lived on his modest $85,000 annual salary. When his wife Emma, a successful attorney, suddenly proposed a prenuptial agreement after 3 years of marriage, Daniel felt betrayed. But Emma didn't know that Daniel's grandfather, who had abandoned his family, had just died, leaving behind a massive empire. As the inheritance letter reached Daniel's hands, he discovered that Emma's true motivation behind their love was only money. Now Daniel had to decide: reveal the truth or let Emma continue living in the illusion of an asset-protecting marriage she thought she was controlling. Before we keep going, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit that like button if you're ready for what's coming next, and drop a comment telling us where you're tuning in from. Chicago, Los Angeles, or maybe Miami. Let's jump back in to see how Daniel handles this life-changing discovery. The familiar hum of the coffee machine filled the modest Chicago apartment as Daniel Thompson stood in his kitchen, watching the morning brew drip into the glass pot. At 42, he had grown accustomed to these quiet moments before the city awakened, before Emma rushed through her morning routine like a woman perpetually late for court. He preferred these solitary minutes when he could hear his own thoughts above the chaos of their increasingly complicated life. The apartment reflected their middle-class existence, comfortable but unremarkable, with furniture they had bought piece by piece over 3 years of marriage, each item a small negotiation between his practical preferences and her need for something that looked more expensive than it actually was. Daniel moved to the window overlooking the street where early commuters hurried toward the elevated train station. His reflection stared back at him, a tall, lean black man with calloused hands that spoke of his work as a mechanical engineer, fixing problems that others couldn't solve. He took pride in those hands, in the honest work they represented, in the way they could coax life back into broken machines. His grandfather had taught him that a man's worth lived in his hands before disappearing from Daniel's life when the boy was barely 7 years old. The memory still stung, even after 35 years of learning to live without explanations or apologies from the man who had simply walked away one winter morning and never returned. "You're up early again." Emma's voice cut through his reverie as she appeared in the doorway, already dressed in one of her perfectly tailored suits. At 38, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had clawed her way up from a working-class background to become a partner at one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms. Her success intimidated some people, but Daniel had always admired her drive, the way she could walk into any room and command respect through sheer competence. This morning, however, something felt different about her presence, a tension that made the air between them feel charged with unspoken words. "Couldn't sleep," Daniel replied, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. He handed her the one with the law firm's logo, a gift from her colleagues that she insisted on using every morning. "You seem restless too," kept tossing and turning. He watched her face carefully, noting the way she avoided direct eye contact as she accepted the coffee. Emma had always been direct, almost brutally honest, but lately she had developed a habit of looking just past him when they spoke, as if she were seeing something he couldn't perceive, planning something she couldn't yet articulate. "Just work stress," she said, but her voice carried a note he couldn't identify. "Actually, Daniel, there's something we need to discuss, something important." She set down her coffee without taking a sip and moved to the kitchen island where she had left her briefcase the night before. The leather case looked expensive, professional, the kind of accessory that announced its owner's success to anyone who cared to notice. Emma opened it with the precision of someone who had organized every aspect of her life into neat, controllable compartments. Daniel felt his stomach tighten as she pulled out a manila folder, thick with legal documents. "What's this about?" he asked, though some instinct already whispered warnings he didn't want to hear. He had seen that folder before, noticed it appearing and disappearing from her briefcase over the past few weeks, but had assumed it contained work-related materials. Now, seeing her handle it with such deliberate care, he realized he had been naive to think their personal life remained separate from her professional calculations. "It's a prenuptial agreement," Emma said, her voice taking on the measured tone she used with difficult clients. "I know it seems unusual to discuss this now, after 3 years of marriage, but it's really a post-nuptial agreement. My partners at the firm have been advising me about asset protection And given my recent promotion and the increase in my income, she trailed off, finally meeting his eyes. Daniel, I'm making twice what you make now, and with my career trajectory, that gap is only going to widen. This isn't personal, it's just practical. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow, each syllable carefully chosen to sound reasonable while delivering maximum damage. He stared at the documents in her hands, understanding immediately that their marriage had become a business transaction in her mind, something that required legal protection and financial planning rather than trust and commitment. Asset protection, he repeated slowly, tasting the bitter clinical nature of the phrase. Is that what we are now? Assets that need protecting? Emma's expression softened slightly, but not enough to hide the determination underneath. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I've worked incredibly hard to get where I am, and I need to protect what I've built. The agreement I am fair. It simply ensures that what each of us brought into the marriage and what we earn individually remains our own property. It's what smart people do, Daniel. It's what successful couples do. Her words carried the weight of someone who had already made her decision and was now simply managing the aftermath, conducting damage control on a conversation she had clearly rehearsed. Daniel set down his coffee mug with deliberate care, afraid that any sudden movement might reveal the depth of his hurt and anger. 3 years of marriage, and she was asking him to sign away any claim to their shared future, to accept that their love came with conditions and fine print. And what if I don't want to sign it? He asked quietly. What if I think marriage should mean something more than a business partnership with sexual benefits? The question hung between them like a challenge, and Daniel saw something flicker across Emma's face. Surprise that he would resist, irritation that he was complicating what she clearly viewed as a simple matter. Then we have a problem, she said finally. Because this isn't negotiable, Daniel. This is happening. The only question is whether you're going to make it ugly or if we can handle it like adults. Her ultimatum delivered with lawyerly precision, leaving no room for compromise or further discussion. Daniel sat alone in his workshop later that evening, surrounded by the familiar smell of motor oil and metal shavings that had always brought him comfort. The garage behind their apartment building served as his sanctuary, filled with vintage car parts he collected and restored in his spare time. Tonight, however, even the soothing ritual of working with his hands couldn't quiet the storm in his mind. Emma's words echoed relentlessly. This isn't negotiable. He picked up a carburetor he had been rebuilding for months, its intricate mechanisms a puzzle he understood far better than his own marriage had apparently become. The weight of the metal piece triggered a memory that pulled him back 35 years to a cramped South Side apartment where 7-year-old Daniel had watched his grandfather Samuel work on similar engines in their building's basement. Samuel Thompson had been a towering figure in young Daniel's life, a man whose hands could fix anything broken and whose stories painted pictures of a world beyond their neighborhood's limitations. Remember this, Danny boy, his grandfather had said, his voice deep and warm as he guided small fingers around a wrench. A man who can build something with his hands can never be truly poor. Money comes and goes, but skill and knowledge, they stay with you forever. Those words had carried Daniel through his childhood after Samuel disappeared without explanation, leaving behind only questions and a devastated family. Daniel's grandmother had refused to speak about the abandonment, her grief transforming into bitter silence that filled their apartment like poison gas. His mother, barely 25 and suddenly responsible for everyone, had worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat, her exhaustion becoming the defining characteristic of Daniel's youth. Your grandfather was a dreamer, she would say when Daniel asked why Samuel had left. Sometimes dreamers forget about the people who need them to stay grounded. The memory shifted to another scene, 15 years later, when Daniel had graduated from engineering school with honors despite the financial struggles that had threatened to derail his education multiple times. His mother had cried at the ceremony, her pride mixed with exhaustion from years of sacrifice. You did this without him, she had whispered, holding Daniel's diploma with trembling hands. You proved that we didn't need his help or his money. The words had felt like victory, then, validation that hard work and determination could overcome abandonment and broken promises. Daniel set down the carburetor and wiped his hands on a rag, the present moment crashing back with uncomfortable clarity. Emma had never understood his attachment to this workshop, had never seen the connection between fixing broken engines and fixing broken lives. To her, his hobby represented time that could be better spent advancing his career or networking with people who could accelerate their social climbing. "You're too satisfied with mediocrity," she had told him once after he declined a promotion that would have required relocating to corporate headquarters in Detroit. "You could be making six figures if you weren't so attached to your little projects." The conversation about the post-nuptial agreement suddenly took on new dimensions in his mind. Emma wasn't just protecting her assets, she was establishing a hierarchy that placed her success and above their partnership, creating legal documentation of his inadequacy as a provider. The realization stung because it confirmed suspicions he had been suppressing for months, that their marriage had become a source of frustration for her rather than joy, that his contentment with a middle-class income represented a limitation she needed to manage rather than a choice she could respect. His phone buzzed with a text message from Emma. "Gone to dinner with colleagues. Don't wait up. We can discuss the agreement tomorrow when you have had time to process." The casual dismissal in those words revealed how thoroughly she had already decided the outcome of their conversation. She wasn't seeking his input or trying to understand his perspective. She was simply waiting for him to accept the inevitable and sign where indicated. Daniel walked to the small refrigerator in the corner and pulled out a beer, twisting off the cap with more force than necessary. The workshop suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a hiding place, somewhere he retreated when the real world became too complicated to navigate. His grandfather's tools hung on the wall, purchased at an estate sale years ago, when Daniel had convinced himself that owning them would somehow bridge the gap Samuel had created by leaving. Now those tools seemed to mock his naivety, reminders of a man who had abandoned responsibility for reasons Daniel might never understand. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his adult life proving he could succeed without Samuel's guidance, only to find himself married to a woman who viewed his achievements as insufficient insurance against an uncertain future. Emma's prenup represented everything his grandfather's departure had taught him to fear. The message that love came with conditions, that commitment meant different things to different people, and that security had always trumped sentiment when the stakes were high enough. He finished his beer and locked up the workshop, walking back toward their apartment with heavy steps. Tomorrow would bring another conversation about signatures and legal protections, another opportunity for Emma to explain why their marriage needed attorneys and contracts to survive. Tonight, however, Daniel simply wanted to sleep and temporarily escape the growing certainty that the woman he had married was becoming a stranger who spoke his language but no longer shared his values. The confrontation Daniel had been dreading arrived 3 days later over breakfast, when Emma spread the post-nuptial agreement across their dining table like a general laying out battle plans. She had color-coded the sections with sticky tabs and prepared talking points that she delivered with the same professional efficiency she used to dismantle opposing arguments in court. "I've highlighted the key provisions," she said, pointing to various paragraphs with a gold-plated pen that had been a gift from her law firm partners. Section 3 addresses income earned during marriage. Section 5 covers inheritance and gifts. And Section 7 outlines the division of assets should we ever need to separate our finances permanently. Daniel stared at the documents without reading them, his attention focused instead on Emma's transformation from wife to attorney. She had dressed for the occasion in her most intimidating business suit, her hair pulled back severely, her makeup applied with precision that made her look like she was preparing for a corporate takeover rather than a marriage conversation. "Should we ever need to separate our finances permanently?" he repeated slowly. "Is that how you're thinking about our marriage now? As a temporary arrangement that needs an exit strategy?" "I'm thinking about our marriage practically," Emma replied, her voice taking on the patient tone she used with particularly slow clients. "Love doesn't pay mortgages, Daniel. Love doesn't secure retirement funds or protect against lawsuits or provide for children's education expenses. I've worked too hard to build my career to risk losing everything because of romantic idealism." She leaned back in her chair, studying his face with the calculating expression of someone evaluating a witness's credibility. "Besides, if our marriage is as strong as you claim it is, then this agreement should never matter. It's just insurance, like buying a life insurance policy. You don't expect to die, but you protect your loved ones just in case." The comparison made Daniel's stomach turn. "So our love needs insurance now? Our commitment requires legal backup plans. He pushed the papers away from him, unable to bear looking at the clinical language that reduced their relationship to financial terms and asset allocation formulas. Emma, when did we stop trusting each other enough to build something together without lawyers and escape clauses? The question came out harsher than he had intended, but he couldn't soften the edges when the entire conversation felt like an attack on everything he had believed about their partnership. Emma's expression hardened, her professional mask slipping to reveal genuine irritation underneath. Trust is a luxury for people who don't have anything to lose, she said sharply. I've seen too many divorce cases where successful women got destroyed financially because they believed in fairy tale endings instead of protecting themselves legally. I'm not going to be one of those cautionary tales, Daniel. I refuse to let emotional thinking sabotage 20 years of career building. Emotional thinking? Daniel stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped against the floor with a harsh screech. Is that what you call our marriage? Emotional thinking that's sabotaging your real priorities? The words felt like they were coming from someone else, someone angrier and more hurt than he wanted to admit being. Jesus, Emma, listen to yourself. You sound like you're describing a business merger, not a relationship between two people who supposedly love each other. Love isn't enough. Emma's voice rose to match his intensity, her careful composure finally cracking under the pressure. Love doesn't guarantee anything, Daniel. Love doesn't prevent people from changing their minds or finding better opportunities or simply growing apart over time. I need more security than romantic promises and good intentions. She gestured around their modest apartment with a sweep of her hand that encompassed their carefully chosen furniture and wedding photos. This isn't enough for me anymore. This middle-class contentment, this satisfaction with mediocrity, it's not the life I want to build. The admission hung between them like a physical barrier, confirming fears Daniel had been trying to suppress for months. Mediocrity, he repeated quietly, the word cutting deeper than any direct insult could have. Is that what you think of our life? Of me? He looked around their home with new eyes, seeing their shared space through Emma's perspective. Cramped and ordinary, lacking the luxury and status she clearly craved. When did I become an embarrassment to you, Emma? When did my job and my income become something you needed to protect yourself from? Emma's face flushed, but she didn't deny the implication. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and returned to her attorney persona, speaking with cold precision. I need a partner who can match my ambition and my earning potential. I need someone who understands that success requires sacrifice and strategic thinking. She paused, seeming to realize that her next words would cross a line they couldn't uncross. I need someone who wants more from life than fixing old cars and celebrating small victories. Daniel felt something fundamental shift inside him, like a foundation settling after years of hidden damage. Then you don't need me, he said simply. You need a different husband, one who fits better into your master plan for wealth and status accumulation. He walked toward their bedroom, pausing at the doorway to look back at her. I'm going to stay with Marcus for a few days while I figure out what I want to do about this. But Emma, I want you to understand something. I won't sign that agreement. Not because I want your money, but because I won't participate in turning our marriage into a business contract. Daniel, wait. Emma's voice lost its professional edge, revealing something that might have been panic underneath. You're overreacting. We can work through this. We just need to approach it rationally, without letting emotions cloud our judgment. But her words felt hollow now, desperate attempts to control a situation that had already spiraled beyond her careful planning. No, Daniel said, surprising himself with the finality in his voice. I think we've been approaching everything too rationally. Maybe that's been our problem all along. He left her sitting at the table surrounded by legal documents and color-coded tabs. Her perfectly planned presentation reduced to meaningless paper, now that its target had refused to play the assigned role. Marcus Williams had been Daniel's closest friend since college. The kind of man who asked no questions when someone showed up at his door with a duffel bag and wounded pride. His South Loop apartment reflected his success as a financial advisor. Modern furniture, city views, and a wine collection that impressed clients. But Marcus himself remained unchanged from their university days, still preferring beer to wine and honest conversation to small talk. You look like hell, Marcus said when Daniel appeared at his door on Thursday evening, rain-soaked and carrying everything he owned in 2 bags. Emma finally drive you crazy with all that legal eagle nonsense? Daniel collapsed onto Marcus's leather couch, grateful for the lack of judgment in his friend's voice. She wants me to sign a postnup, he said simply, knowing Marcus would understand the implications without lengthy explanations. Says our marriage needs asset protection and exit strategies. The words sounded even more absurd spoken aloud in Marcus's comfortable bachelor pad, where no lawyers lurked behind every conversation and love wasn't measured in earning potential or career advancement opportunities. Damn, Marcus whistled low, settling into his recliner with 2 open beers. 3 years in and she wants to lawyer up? That's cold, even for Emma. He had never particularly liked Daniel's wife, though he had been diplomatic enough to keep his opinions mostly to himself during family gatherings and holiday parties. So what's your play? Sign the thing and move on, or take a stand on principle. Before Daniel could answer, Marcus's doorman called from the lobby. Package delivery for Daniel Thompson. The voice crackled through the intercom system. Says it's urgent legal documents. Daniel and Marcus exchanged puzzled looks, neither expecting mail to be forwarded so quickly to this address. Send him up, Marcus replied, then turned to Daniel with raised eyebrows. Emma working fast to serve you papers already? The delivery man, who appeared minutes later, carried an envelope from a law firm Daniel had never heard of, Blackstone, Morrison and Associates, with a downtown Chicago address in letterhead that suggested serious money and old-fashioned respectability. Daniel Samuel Thompson, the courier asked, checking his identification carefully before obtaining a signature. This requires personal delivery and signed receipt. The formality felt ominous, like receiving a subpoena or a court summons rather than routine correspondence. Daniel waited until the courier left before opening the envelope with shaking hands, his mind racing through possibilities. Lawsuit notifications, debt collection agencies, or perhaps some legal complication related to Emma's demands for asset protection. The letter inside, however, began with words that stopped his heart. We regret to inform you of the death of Samuel Benjamin Thompson, your paternal grandfather, who passed away on October 15th in Palm Beach, Florida. Jesus Christ, Daniel breathed, sinking back onto the couch as the words blurred before his eyes. Samuel Thompson, the grandfather who had disappeared from his life 35 years ago without explanation or apology, had been alive all this time, living in luxury while Daniel's family struggled through poverty and abandonment. He's been alive, Daniel whispered to Marcus, who was reading over his shoulder with increasing amazement. All these years, while we thought he was dead, he's been alive in Florida. Marcus grabbed the letter and read aloud the paragraph that had rendered Daniel speechless. As the sole surviving heir designated in Mr. Thompson's last will and testament, you are entitled to inherit his complete estate, valued at approximately $1.5 billion, including real estate holdings, business interests, and liquid assets. The number seemed impossible, like a lottery ticket or a practical joke rather than legitimate inheritance documentation. Billion with a B, Marcus repeated slowly. Daniel, your grandfather was a billionaire. Daniel's hands trembled as he continued reading, learning about real estate empires and business ventures that had transformed his grandfather from the man who had fixed car engines in basement workshops to someone who owned skyscrapers and investment portfolios. The letter outlined decades of wealth accumulation, strategic acquisitions, and financial success that had occurred entirely without his family's knowledge. Samuel Thompson had become rich beyond imagination while his grandson learned to change oil and rebuild carburetors, never knowing that mechanical aptitude ran in a family that had produced both laborers and moguls. There's more, Marcus said, pointing to additional pages that detailed the scope of the inheritance. Commercial properties in 6 states, a hedge fund, something called Thompson Development Corporation, and personal assets including homes in Palm Beach, Martha's Vineyard, and Aspen. He looked up at Daniel with an expression caught between excitement and disbelief. Dude, you're about to become one of the richest black men in America. This is a DNA. Daniel stared at photographs of properties he now apparently owned, mansion estates with ocean views, corporate headquarters bearing his family name, and business enterprises he couldn't begin to understand. The grandfather who had abandoned his family had somehow built all of this wealth while leaving them to struggle without his support or explanation. Why now? Daniel asked the empty room. Why leave me everything after 35 years of silence? Why not help when we actually needed it? The final pages of the documents provided partial answers that only raised more questions. Samuel Thompson had established a private foundation dedicated to supporting educational opportunities for underprivileged children, had quietly funded scholarships and community programs throughout the Midwest, and had apparently been monitoring his family's progress from a distance without ever making contact. He knew about your engineering degree, Marcus pointed out, showing Daniel a folder of newspaper clippings and school records. He kept track of everything, your grades, your job, your marriage. He knew about your life but never reached out. Daniel stood up abruptly and walked to Marcus's window, staring down at the Chicago streets where ordinary people lived ordinary lives without billion-dollar inheritances or mysterious family secrets. Tomorrow he would need to call the attorneys, begin the process of claiming an empire he had never imagined, and somehow reconcile the grandfather's abandonment with this overwhelming gesture of posthumous generosity. But tonight he simply felt the weight of secrets and money and complicated family history settling on his shoulders like a burden he hadn't asked to carry. "What are you going to tell Emma?" Marcus asked quietly, understanding that everything had changed between the moment Daniel had walked through the door and the moment he had opened that envelope. The prenuptial agreement that had seemed so important 12 hours ago now looked like a cruel joke, a legal document designed to protect assets that paled in comparison to the wealth Daniel was about to inherit. Daniel spent the next 3 days researching his grandfather's life with the obsessive focus of a man trying to solve a 35-year-old puzzle. The attorneys at Blackstone, Morrison & Associates had provided him with access to Samuel Thompson's private papers, and what he discovered painted a picture of a brilliant man who had navigated decades of systemic racism to build an empire that most people could never imagine. In 1962, when Samuel was barely 25, he had been denied loans by 17 different banks before finding one willing to finance his first small apartment building purchase. "We don't typically extend credit to your people for real estate investments," one rejection letter had stated with casual cruelty that made Daniel's stomach turn. But Samuel Thompson had persisted, leveraging every small success into larger opportunities, reinvesting profits instead of enjoying luxuries, and slowly accumulating properties throughout the Midwest during an era when few Black entrepreneurs had access to the capital markets that could fuel such expansion. By 1975, he owned 4 apartment complexes in Chicago's South Side. By 1985, he had expanded into commercial real estate and started Thompson Development Corporation. By the time he abandoned his family in 1991, he was already worth over $50 million and positioning himself for the massive growth that would follow during the tech boom and real estate speculation of the next 2 decades. Daniel found journal entries that revealed his grandfather's internal struggles with success and family responsibility. "Every day I stay, I put them in danger," Samuel had written in 1990. "The threats are getting more specific, more personal. They know where Danny goes to school, what time Margaret gets home from work. Money brings enemies, and I won't let my family become targets for people who resent what I've built." The entries described anonymous phone calls, vandalism at his properties, and business associates who suggested that Samuel was getting too big for his situation and needed to remember his place in the natural order. Marcus helped Daniel process the overwhelming information, serving as a sounding board for emotions that ranged from fury to grief to disbelief. "So he left to protect you," Marcus summarized after reading through several boxes of documents. "He didn't abandon his family. He removed himself to keep you safe from people who wanted to destroy what he was building." The explanation provided context but couldn't erase 35 years of feeling unwanted and forgotten by the most important male figure in Daniel's early childhood. While Daniel was discovering the truth about his grandfather's motivations, Emma had begun calling with increasing frequency. Her messages started as professional requests for updates on his situation, but gradually revealed a desperation that surprised him. "Daniel, we need to talk," her voice said on his phone. "I may have been too hasty about the agreement. Maybe we can find a compromise that works for both of us." The sudden flexibility in her position seemed suspicious, especially since she had been so adamant about the non-negotiable nature of her demands just days earlier. The suspicious nature of Emma's outreach became clearer when Daniel realized that news of major inheritance proceedings had leaked to legal circles where Emma's colleagues would certainly have heard rumors. Chicago's legal community was smaller than people realized, and probate matters involving billion-dollar estates didn't remain secret for long when multiple law firms were involved in processing the paperwork. She knows, Daniel told Marcus after listening to Emma's fifth voicemail in 2 days. Somehow she found out about the inheritance, and now she's backtracking on everything she said about asset protection. Emma's next call confirmed his suspicions. Honey, I've been thinking about our conversation, and I realize I may have approached things badly, she said, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been present in months. I love you, Daniel, and I don't want legal documents coming between us. Maybe we should just forget about the whole prenup idea and focus on building our future together. The sudden transformation from demanding attorney to loving wife would have been laughable if it weren't so transparently motivated by financial calculations rather than genuine affection. Daniel decided to test Emma's renewed devotion by proposing a scenario that would reveal her true priorities. He called her back and arranged to meet at their favorite restaurant, a modest Italian place where they had celebrated their first anniversary and where Emma had once complained about the lack of valet parking and proper wine selection. I have something important to tell you, he said when she arrived wearing her most attractive dress and the perfume she knew he loved. I've been offered a position at a small engineering firm in Milwaukee. It's exactly the kind of work I've always wanted to do. Renewable energy projects, community development, really meaningful stuff. Emma's smile faltered slightly, but she maintained her supportive facade. That sounds wonderful, honey. Tell me about the details. Her voice remained encouraging, though Daniel could see the calculation behind her eyes as she processed the implications of a potential move away from Chicago and her established career network. The salary is lower than what I make now, Daniel continued, watching Emma's reaction carefully. About $45,000 a year to start, but the work would be incredibly fulfilling. We'd have to downsize our living situation, maybe rent something smaller, but I think it could be exactly what I need to feel passionate about my career again. He reached across the table to take her hand, noting how her fingers stiffened at his touch despite her continued smile. Daniel, Emma said carefully, I understand wanting meaningful work, but we have to be practical about our financial responsibilities. A $20,000 pay cut would seriously impact our quality of life, especially if we're thinking about starting a family or buying a house eventually. Her lawyer training showed in how she framed her objections as concern for their shared future rather than personal disappointment about his reduced earning potential. So you think I should stay in Chicago and keep doing work that doesn't inspire me? Just for the money? Daniel asked, applying gentle pressure to see how far her newfound flexibility would stretch. I thought you said love was more important than financial considerations when you called earlier this week. Emma's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the calculation that had always lurked beneath her romantic declarations. Love doesn't pay rent, Daniel, she said sharply, then seemed to realize she had contradicted her recent messaging about forgetting financial concerns. I mean, we have to balance love with practical realities. $45,000 isn't enough to support the kind of life we want to build together. Daniel pulled his hand away from hers and leaned back in his chair, finally understanding with complete clarity that Emma's affection had always been conditional on his ability to contribute to her vision of upward mobility. Her recent change of heart about the prenuptial agreement had nothing to do with love and everything to do with rumors about inheritance money that could elevate her social status beyond anything his engineering salary could provide. Daniel returned to their apartment 3 days later with a clarity he hadn't possessed since receiving the inheritance letter. The familiar space looked smaller somehow, as if his expanded understanding of possibilities had shrunk the physical boundaries of his former contentment. Emma was waiting for him with nervous energy that manifested in obsessive cleaning and meal preparation, activities she typically delegated to weekend schedules or hired services when her work demands intensified. I made your favorite dinner, she announced as he walked through the door, gesturing toward the dining table set with their wedding china and candles that hadn't appeared since their last anniversary celebration. We need to talk honestly, Daniel said, declining to sit at the elaborately prepared table. No more games, no more legal strategies, no more pretending we want the same things from this marriage. He remained standing in their living room, creating physical distance that reflected the emotional space that had opened between them over the past week. I know you've heard rumors about some kind of inheritance situation, and I know that's why you suddenly decided the prenup wasn't such a good idea after all. Emma's carefully constructed facade cracked visibly, her expression shifting from artificial warmth to the calculating attorney persona that had become her default mode during difficult conversations. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I genuinely reconsidered our situation because I realized I was being too harsh about the financial protection issue. The lie came smoothly, practiced and polished, though she couldn't quite meet his eyes while delivering it. Really? Daniel asked, his tone carrying the weight of everything he had discovered about both his grandfather's legacy and his wife's true motivations. So if I told you right now that there is no inheritance, that the rumors are false and I'm still the same middle-class engineer I was last week, you'd still want to tear up that prenup and build a future based on love and trust? He watched her face carefully, seeing the micro-expressions that betrayed her internal calculations, even as she struggled to maintain her supportive wife performance. Emma hesitated for just a moment too long before answering, and that pause revealed everything Daniel needed to know about where her priorities actually resided. Of course I would, she said finally, but the words felt hollow and desperate rather than convincing. Daniel, money doesn't matter to me the way you think it does. I love you for who you are, not for what you might inherit from family members you barely knew. The protest sounded rehearsed, as if she had practiced this conversation multiple times while he was away. Daniel walked to the window overlooking their modest neighborhood, seeing the familiar view with new perspective, shaped by weeks of revelation about family secrets and personal truths. Here's what I've learned about myself lately, he said without turning around. I spent 35 years thinking my grandfather abandoned us because we weren't worth staying for. I built my whole identity around proving I could succeed without his help or his money. I married you believing that love could exist independently of financial calculations and social status ambitions. He turned back to face Emma, who was standing frozen beside their elaborate dinner table like an actress who had forgotten her lines. But you've taught me something important about conditional affection, about relationships that depend on earning potential and upward mobility rather than actual compatibility or shared values. You've shown me what happens when love becomes a business transaction with performance metrics and exit strategies. You're being unfair, Emma said, her voice rising with defensive anger. I worked hard to build my career, and I have every right to protect what I've earned. That doesn't mean I don't love you. It means that I'm practical about securing our future together. She moved toward him with hands extended, attempting physical reconciliation that might bypass the intellectual honesty he was demanding from their conversation. Daniel stepped away from her approach, maintaining the distance that had become necessary for clear thinking. Our future together, he repeated slowly, except you've spent months making it clear that our future depends entirely on my ability to contribute financially to your vision of success. You've never asked what I want from life. You've only evaluated whether my wants align with your strategic planning for wealth accumulation and social advancement. Emma's professional composure finally collapsed completely, revealing the raw ambition that had always driven her decision-making process. What's wrong with wanting more from life, she demanded. What's wrong with expecting my husband to share my goals instead of being satisfied with mediocrity and small dreams? I refuse to apologize for having standards and expectations for our partnership. The admission confirmed everything Daniel had suspected about her true feelings regarding his contentment with middle-class stability. Nothing's wrong with wanting more, Daniel replied calmly, but everything's wrong with viewing your spouse as an investment vehicle rather than a human being worthy of love regardless of his earning capacity. He looked around their apartment one final time, understanding that this space had never truly represented shared dreams, but rather Emma's temporary acceptance of circumstances she planned to improve through strategic relationship management. I'm going to stay with Marcus permanently while we figure out divorce proceedings, Daniel continued, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of officially ending their marriage. I won't contest anything you want from our current assets. Keep the apartment, keep your protected career, keep whatever security you think legal documents can provide. But Emma, I need you to understand something. I would have given you everything if you had just loved me for who I am instead of measuring my worth against your professional advancement timeline. Emma stared at him with an expression caught between disbelief and calculation, still processing the implications of losing both a husband and whatever inheritance benefits she had anticipated claiming. "You're making a mistake," she said finally. "You're letting pride destroy something good because you can't handle having a wife who's more successful than you are." The accusation felt like a final attempt to shift responsibility onto him rather than acknowledging her role in reducing their marriage to financial considerations. Daniel picked up the keys he had left on their kitchen counter a week earlier, feeling lighter with each step toward the door. "No, Emma, I'm finally making the right choice for the first time in 3 years. I'm choosing self-respect over convenience, authenticity over compromise, and hope over settling for someone who sees me as a liability to manage rather than a partner to cherish." 6 months later, Daniel stood in the boardroom of Thompson Development Corporation, surrounded by mahogany panels and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked downtown Chicago from the 32nd floor. The building bore his family name in elegant bronze letters, a legacy he was still learning to carry with dignity rather than burden. Around the polished conference table sat 12 board members who had worked with his grandfather for decades, their faces reflecting mixtures of curiosity and respect as they listened to Daniel outline his vision for the company's future direction. "The Samuel Thompson Foundation will expand its educational initiatives to include vocational training program," Daniel explained, pointing to detailed plans he had developed with input from community leaders and educators. "We're going to partner with local high schools to create apprenticeship opportunities in construction, engineering, and renewable energy sectors. Every young person who completes our program will graduate with both skills and guaranteed employment at Thompson Development Projects." The proposal represented everything his grandfather had believed about the power of opportunity and hard work to transform individual lives and entire communities. Board member Patricia Williams, a sharp-eyed woman who had been Samuel's longtime business partner, nodded approvingly as Daniel described budget allocations and implementation timelines. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said after he finished his presentation. "He always said the money was just a tool for building something more meaningful than personal wealth. He wanted to create opportunities for people who looked like him, who came from backgrounds like his, who needed someone to believe in their potential before they could believe in it themselves." Daniel had chosen to accept his inheritance not because he suddenly craved luxury or status, but because he finally understood his grandfather's true legacy. The billions of dollars represented decades of strategic thinking about generational impact rather than personal gratification. Samuel Thompson had built an empire specifically to be inherited by someone who would use it responsibly, someone who understood the difference between having money and being consumed by it. The divorce proceedings with Emma had concluded with surprising efficiency once she realized that Daniel's inheritance was being channeled primarily into charitable foundations rather than personal accounts accessible through marriage dissolution. Her attorney had initially pursued aggressive strategies for claiming community property rights, but those efforts collapsed when financial disclosures revealed that Daniel was keeping only enough personal wealth to maintain a comfortable but unremarkable lifestyle while dedicating the vast majority of his grandfather's estate to philanthropic purposes. Emma had signed the final papers with visible frustration, her disappointment obvious when she realized that divorcing Daniel would not provide access to the billion-dollar windfall she had anticipated. "You're wasting an incredible opportunity," she had said during their last conversation. "You could be one of the most powerful men in Chicago, and instead you're giving it all away to charity cases and feel-good community programs." Her inability to understand his decision had confirmed that ending their marriage was the right choice for both of them. Daniel now lived in a modest townhouse in Hyde Park, close enough to his foundation offices for walking commutes, but far enough from downtown luxury to maintain perspective about what truly mattered in daily life. His workshop occupied the garage, still filled with vintage car parts and restoration projects that provided the same therapeutic satisfaction they had always offered. The difference was that now he worked on engines because he enjoyed the process rather than because he needed an escape from marital disappointment and professional frustration. Last week, he had met Sarah Mitchell at a community center where she taught literacy classes to adults who had never learned to read properly. She was a librarian who drove a 12-year-old Honda and wore clothes from thrift stores. But her passion for helping others learn and grow made her more attractive than any woman Daniel had ever encountered. When she laughed at his jokes about carburetor troubles, he felt something he hadn't experienced with Emma even during their best moments. Genuine connection with someone who appreciated him for his character rather than his potential contribution to her life plan. So, what's next for Thompson Development? Patricia asked as the board meeting concluded and members began gathering their papers and preparing for afternoon appointments. Daniel looked out the windows at the city where his grandfather had built an empire and where he would now continue that legacy in his own way. We're going to prove that businesses can be profitable and socially responsible simultaneously, he said. We're going to create jobs, build communities, and demonstrate that success should be measured by positive impact rather than just financial accumulation. We're going to show young people that they can achieve anything if someone gives them the right opportunities and support. The vision felt authentic in a way that his marriage to Emma never had, rooted in values that honored his grandfather's memory while creating something uniquely his own. Daniel Thompson was finally ready to build a life worthy of the name he carried and the legacy he had inherited.